Well, I know what you're thinking. Why is he doing weird impressions? What is this week's episode about? Being as this is a 0.5mm pencil, the most powerful pencil in the stationery cupboard. You better tune in and find out. Punk! Well, that was an interesting intro, and it's true, I've been forced into some impressions this week. The reason is primarily the date of when this incident happened that we're going to look at, and it moves us on nicely from Lime Street, where we looked at the use of track circuits. This one's going to cover a bit about the use of axle counters, which is an alternative form of train detection to track circuits, and it also fits in nicely with Network Rail publishing this info that it updated the track and some of the other equipment in the Severn tunnel. So the Severn tunnel is between Bristol and Wales. So we'll shrink me down and we'll have a look at what happened in the Severn tunnel accident. Here we are then at the River Severn. The River Severn. Quite a hard thing for you to say with a Scottish accent without mucking it up. Severn. The River Severn. The Severn tunnel. So the Severn tunnel, as you can see, on the left there is Wales. If you're not familiar, on this side, Bristol, is England. And the Severn is famous for the Severn Bore, where the tide comes up and you can surf on it, I think. And also the Severn Bridge. It's pretty cool. I mean, it's not the Tay Bridge, it's not the Forth Bridge, but it's still pretty cool. So here you have, on the English side, the entrance to the tunnel, and it pretty much, you can see it comes under this little spot called Sudbrook, and if you look about there, you can kind of figure out that underneath there is probably where the tunnel runs, because it's a nice straight line. Well, it's actually a nice curved line, and it comes right up underneath the railway. And obviously nature stuff doesn't grow in straight lines, so if you see something, I actually thought this was an old line before I figured out where the Severn tunnel ran. But if you see something like this, if you see a feature like this in the countryside somewhere, good chance it used to be a railway and it's got a bit overgrown. These are everywhere in Britain, all these sort of post-beaching cuts. Oh my god, did he mention beaching? I mentioned beaching. So yeah, you find these features all over the landscape, but I think this one is just maybe left over from having, maybe they dug the tunnel straight from, I don't know how they dug the tunnel, but it's obviously tells me that the tunnel's underneath that part. I'm not an expert in tunnels. Find a podcast, The Tunnel Guy, and you'll understand how they built the Severn tunnel. Not going to go into too much detail of it. You see it runs all the way under these houses here, and it probably runs pretty much directly under that row of houses there, under that street. I wonder what that's like. And you can see from the bottom it is 4.33 miles. That's a big ass tunnel. Even by any standards, that's a pretty big tunnel. 4 miles of tunnel, that's a lot. One thing I'm going to tell you about working in tunnels, I've worked in tunnels, railway tunnels. Pretty dirty, pretty wet, bit fusty, bit manky, not the most pleasant, proper dark. Like, there's no dark like tunnel dark, especially I've not been in a 4 mile tunnel, but there's no dark like tunnel dark. And the only thing I can imagine that can make a tunnel worse is that it's a tunnel under the sea, because water is a pain, of course, for signalling equipment, but salt water is awful. I've been at railway locations that are, I remember being at one that was, I measured it as a crow flies, it was about 800 metres, and I didn't actually realise I was that close to the sea, just with the topography and stuff, and where I didn't really know where I was, and I got to this location, I was like, this location is like rotting away, what the hell's going on here? And then I realised it's the sea air. So sea water, being underground, Very, very difficult conditions for signalling equipment. Difficult conditions for any equipment, even just to keep the track in good order. And Severn Tunnel is also electrified, which is good. So at the time of this accident, we have got Her Majesty's Railway Inspectorate conducting the post-mortem, and you can see right away that it happened on December 7th, 1991, a date that will live in infamy. Now you know why I had to do the impressions. I had to. If you know who that was, let me know in the comments. If you don't know who it was, let me know in the comments and I'll come on and tell you should have paid attention in history class. I didn't give you the real date, the real year. That would have made it too easy. So the Severn Tunnel accident happened in 1991 on the 7th of December. And I've been a bit more flippant with this episode. What I'm going to do is I'm actually recording this as I read the report. So I already know what happened in this accident. But I was pretty caught out when I read the Lime Street one, which I thought I knew what happened in. So this accident, again, I think I know what happened. But I'm going to record the podcast while I read the report for the first time, and might make my reactions a wee bit more lively and interesting for you. Okay, so here it is on Saturday, 7th of December 1991, about 10:30am. A diesel sprinter train travelling from Portsmouth Harbour to Cardiff collided with the rear of a London to Cardiff high-speed train. Lucky it wasn't the other way around, because that would have been nasty. This happened towards the Welsh end of the Severn Tunnel. The driver of the sprinter sustained serious injuries, including a fractured skull and loss of sight in one eye. Doesn't say if that's permanent or not. I hope it wasn't. Nearly 300 passengers were travelling on the two trains. So I hope by now you're already thinking, tunnels are really the worst place to have an accident, pretty much, yeah. Tunnels are bad places to have accidents, especially if you're crashing into the back of a diesel train with another diesel train. But okay, so 300 passengers, 185 of them are injured. That's more than half. So your injury rate is well over 50%. So not great. 5 seriously. Hopefully they're all right now. And all experienced. And now this is probably the most British thing I'm going to read this week. As well as 185 of them being injured and 5 of them seriously. All experienced an unpleasant and lengthy delay in the tunnel while the rescue operation was mounted. Yeah, I mean, people were injured, but everyone, not only was some people injured, everyone experienced an unpleasant and lengthy delay. Well, there you go. That's enlightening. That was from R.J. Seymour, Her Majesty's Chief Inspecting Officer of Railways, also retired. Okay, interesting. So very simply, inside the Severn Tunnel, one train crashed into the back of another. Now, that obviously shouldn't happen, and we've got a bit of layout here, and I'm going to show you how it did happen. But before I explain that to you, I need to show you the difference between track circuits, what track circuits are and how they operate, and axle counters, what they are and how they operate. So let's go back up to the board and we'll get that done. So if we want to get to grips with signalling, we need to understand how track circuits work, for now at least. So we start off with a power supply and we feed it into our rails. So our power supply is in a signalling cabinet somewhere, and we literally run a cable from the cabinet out to the rails. Now you see there's these little joints here. Now they're really electrical symbols, if you like. There's nothing physical across the rails, but between the rails there are insulated rail joints or insulated block joints. Now they have for a simple example, we'll say that there are insulated rail joints at the 4 corners of our track circuit, and our track circuit's got a number. It's more modern practice and more common throughout England historically that track circuits have names, so AA, AB, AD track, or even 3-letter names. But I prefer to use numbers. It's just my personal preference. And you will still see it in large parts of Scotland where the whole thing hasn't been relayed and reconfigured into letter names, but there are some letter name tracks in Scotland, plenty of them. And this is just my personal preference. So we've got 6005 track circuit. So our track circuit is going to be the power supply, the rails divided up, electrically insulated from the adjacent rails. Remember, there's nothing impeding the rail flanges here, so you can still run right through this track, and unless you knew what you were looking for, you wouldn't really see these. And at the other end, no more than 1,000 metres. Again, broadly speaking, one of the limitations on track circuits is length, so no more than 1,000 metres. And we take our power supply and we feed it from the rails into a relay. Now this is where it gets interesting. Here is our relay. The black bit, if I can hold this properly, the black bit at the bottom is the relay coil, and that's where you feed the power supply into. And when you do that, you see that little gap between the black and the brass lever, the brass arm, that is going to be affected by electromagnetism. So when I energize the coil, let's get it just so you can see it properly. When I energize the coil, that gap is going to shut. Electromagnetism is going to force that gap shut. And then, as you can see at the top, if I position this properly, go the other way, tip it towards you. You can see that there's some contacts in there. There we go. There are contacts in there, and they are open at the moment. So they are front contacts, which are open when the relay is de-energized, because I've got it in my hand. Listen. It's not energized. It's not plugged into anything, so it's de-energized. It is down. So when we say, signal engineers say it's down, we mean that the back contacts are made. You can see them at the bottom. And when it goes up, that brass arm will flip up towards the coil, and it will push those contacts at the top closed. And that's what we call the relay being up. So relays are used for other things other than track circuits. So we say relays are up and down. When we talk about tracks, sometimes we still say, if we're being a bit lazy with our language, sometimes we still say the track's up or down. What we mean by that is that it's either clear or occupied. So right now, this track circuit is clear because there's no trains on it. But it's not a complete circuit yet. So to complete this circuit, the other side of the coil also has to be cabled from a relay onto the track. And of course your track are contiguous conductors, and at the opposite end of the track we simply feed back to the supply, and that is our full circuit. So right now we have got a full circuit, our track circuit is clear, and our relay is up. So how are we going to change that? Well, there's a number of ways we can change it. So that's how our track circuit operates normally. Spend most of its time clear with the relay up. Now we're going to bring along our train, and this train, like most trains, if you look underneath it, the wheels are joined together and they're metal and they conduct. So when we put our train across our track circuit, what it does, let me just take it off. Okay, keep in your mind our train is still on our track. It creates a current path across our rails. So these rails aren't joined in any way. They're electrically insulated from the rails adjacent to them longitudinally, and they're also insulated from the rails across them. But the rail wheels come on there and they short out the rails. And that means you don't need to know a lot about electricity to know how this works. But it means that electricity, if you want to think about electricity as lazy, it wants to take the shortest path to get back to the supply. So it doesn't want to go all the way up here and through the relay when there's a nice short path here, and it can go all the way back to the power supply the easy way. If you want to be a little bit more technical, it is about choosing the path of least resistance. That's why I say it's lazy. It chooses the path of least resistance So there's more resistance going this extra length of rail through the relay coil and this length of rail than there is going nice short path. So that is one way in which our track becomes occupied and our relay drops. Now we use the contacts in the relay to tell us what situation the coil's in. Is the coil energised or is the coil de-energised? Outside of equipment failure, that operates pretty well in thousands of instances day to day, from not quite Land's End to John O'Groats, but you know, a large section of the UK railway. I said that length was one of the limitations of track circuits. There are some other limitations. There are some other things that will occupy your track circuit that aren't actually trains. So if we reinstate our clear track circuit with our relay up, relay energised, any break in the rails will drop your track circuit, will occupy your track circuit. In some cases, that sounds like a really bad thing, but in some cases that's really good, because if you've got a broken rail, you want to know about it. There is also something which is becoming more and more common and an increasing problem. The blue stuff, water. So flooding in a track circuit will actually shorten it out. If it's flooded enough and you get a path with low resistance, remember water conducts electricity. So if you get a path, a water path between your rails, a flooded bit of your railway, again, your track circuit's going to be occupied. Is that a bad thing? Depends how bad your flooding is. If your flooding's really bad and your track circuit's occupied and trains can't run through your track circuit, not a terrible thing. Now if we reinstate our track circuit, overcoming the limitations of our track circuit, one thing we can use is the axle counter. So track circuits are a method of train detection, so are axle counters. So what we do in the instance of axle counters then is we fit what's called count heads to the rail. Our count heads then are generating a magnetic field. And what happens is, when our train comes along, the wheels, again, this doesn't impede the flange of the wheels affect the magnetic field, and the count heads detect the passage of each axle. So I've got 6 axles, no I don't, I've got 3 axles. I've got 3 axles in the front of 37502, and I've got 3 axles at the back, so that gives me 6. So as this unit comes over the first count head, it's going to count to 6, so it registers those 6 axles, and associated with the same brains, which is called an evaluator for an axle counter, there's another set of count heads, and they're at the opposite end of your train detection section. Remember, it's not a track circuit, it's axle counter. So again, our 6 axles pass over the count out head, and that counts up to 6. Or effectively what it does is it counts from 6 at the evaluator back down to 0. So 6 wheels in, 6 wheels out, and the evaluator decides if all the internal equipment is operating correctly, then a full train has passed through. And we can be reasonably confident that none of if our 37502 was hauling, 20 coal wagons, each one of those axles would be counted, and if a wagon was detached and left in the middle, its wheels wouldn't be counted out at the end. And this is a pretty it seems very, very simple, but it's a very, very reliable way of detecting train movements. There's a slightly different nomenclature for this. So 6005T now becomes brackets X to let you know that it's an axle counter when you're looking at signalling drawings. And one of the things you might have already picked up on is this. 6005 no longer detects broken rails. And 6005 no longer detects flooding. One of the first applications then of axle counters was areas that are known to be susceptible to flooding. So there are coastal places and examples like the Severn Tunnel. So here we are, our setup on the day of the race. Now this is really important that we figure out how it should work first. So you can see inside the Severn Tunnel, we've got X's, 6005, 6007. These are not the real numbers, these are just chosen for this exercise. Those X's are axle counters because the tunnel is too wet for the track circuits to operate reliably for long periods. So what they did was they brought in axle counters and they trialled them. If you actually think back to the explanation of how tracks and axle counters work, you can have them both operating at the same time on top of each other. They don't actually interfere with each other. So that's what they did. They trialled these by running them together for a year to make sure that the axle counters behaved the same way the tracks did. And they did. So they, by this point, 7th of December 1991, they are using exclusively axle counters at this point, but they have been trialled for a year. So the system of signalling, there are colour light signals, yes, but that's not a system. The system is track circuit block. And what effectively happens is that before N164 signal, I'm not going through the rigmarole of calling it November every time. I know that'll upset some people, but I'm just not doing it. We're podcasting here, we're not all day. So N164 cannot be green unless all of the track circuits ahead are clear, because then it's not safe to put a train into that section because you can't guarantee that it will brake effectively from line speed before it gets to N170. Now that is a slightly simplified explanation of what's happening, but the important thing to remember is that you cannot get it green unless all of the tracks ahead are clear. Incidentally, also N164 will want to prove that N170 is lit. So if the bulbs go out in N170, N164 won't change from red. Also, in this instance, this is just a two-aspect signal. So 164 is either red or it's green, and you don't need me to tell you that means stop or go, with the red being stop. I mean, I'm saying you don't need me to tell you, but I'm telling you. So if you want that signal to be green, you have to have all the track circuits clear, the track circuit 6003, and because it's ahead of the signal, and all of the axle counters clear, and the signal ahead lit. And now if we bring our train through into the tunnel, you'll see that because all of our train detection sections, whether they're axle counters or track circuits, you will see that because all of the sections between 164 signal and 170 signal are not clear, at the moment our train is sat on 6009, then unfortunately we cannot get 164 to be anything better than red, because it's not safe to let the next train through. It's important at this point that also point out that where we are in the history of railways, we're at the end of BR days here, and we're about to enter the not astronomically successful rail track period. And the big issue is investment. Are we willing to spend money on keeping our railway up to date? And the answer at this stage is not a great deal. There's a lot of debate even in the cabinet. Mrs. Thatcher has privatised steel and a number of other things, and even Margaret Thatcher thought that privatisation of the railway was a step too far. Of course, she lost her job and the railway was thereafter privatised anyway, and it's a debate for another day. But in terms of engineering, we are about to look at the consequences of not investing properly in a railway. So the first thing that I'm going to say to you here about the equipment at the Severn Tunnel is, here it is on your screens, a kind of close approximation of what a TDM system is. Now, we must wait for a moment. I'm now wearing my dunce's cap to talk about TDM. The TDM system is basically a telecommunications transmission system, and it takes all of the information about what these track circuits are doing, what the signals are doing, all the other line side signalling equipment, and it sticks them in this magical box. Now, the reason I'm wearing the dunce's cap is because I don't actually know anything about time division multiplexer systems. I know what the letters mean. That's about it. It is just a transmission system that was used at the time, still used in some places, for transmitting data. So it is transmitting the signalling data. I personally have no idea how one works, and that is why I'm wearing my dunce's cap. So while I'm talking to you about TDMs, you don't think I'm an expert, and if I say something wrong, then you'll know it's because I'm a dunce when it comes to telecoms. So TDM systems are on the internet, you can look them up. They're using a lot of other applications other than railway. So basically they take a huge amount of data, or a large amount of data. Maybe huge is getting probably too much of a stretch in today's telecoms parlance. Take a large amount of data, squish it down or whatever, and transmit it through a smaller number of cable cores than you would in traditional signaling. The only important thing to note, other than my craft skills, is that at the Severn tunnel, the TDM was goosed. It was burst. So it's only sending the information back to the signal box. So what they could do is that the information's in the local relay room. So the signalling equipment can still work, the interlocking can still work. It just can't send and receive information back to the signal box. So it means that there is still a certain amount of automatic working happening at Severn tunnel. So the technicians are on site trying to figure out what's wrong with the TDM. That's failed. There's some other telecoms equipment failed. And into that mix, as I've said before, accidents aren't just one thing that goes wrong. If you've watched the other episodes, you heard me talking about Swiss cheese. There are layers of defence in our systems that stop things going wrong. But the first thing that went wrong here was that the TDM failed. And we'll have a little look at what how the report says that the signal box is working then. And I'll also take off the hat. Back to this HMRI report then. So just to highlight how poor the track circuits were performing in the tunnel. The humidity and temperature in the tunnel had led to many right side failures. That's failing properly, failing in a way that you expect it and that's safe. Had led to many right side failures, showing the line occupied. So it looks like there's a train on there, but it isn't. It's the physical conditions are causing short circuits when no train was there. In 1 year, there were 18 track circuit failures, lasting up to 10 hours. So 18 is more than one a month. So if you were a frequent user of the Severn Tunnel in 1990, I suppose, in the year up to it, and 91, then you were doing well. You're a very patient person. Well done. Okay, so that is what led to the decision to install axle counters. It says it here. It's true. The events leading up to the accident, don't worry, Mr. Hancock. I've redacted some of the names. Mr. Hancock is not in any way implicated in the forthcoming shenanigans. And, well, you can read this report if you want yourself. It's available on the internet. So I'm only slightly protecting identities here. Events leading up to the accident began with the failure of the electronic remote control equipment. So that picture that I showed you, the TDM, that wasn't actually a TDM, but it kind of looks like that. It's a cubicle with stuff in it, electrical cards and whatnot, and some telecoms trickery. I should put my dunce hat on again. Okay, so because of this, the signalling was switched into what is known as through routes by means of a control in the signal box. I'd never heard of that until I read this, actually. So, there are some terrible photos. Unfortunately, these are scanned in, so scan them from black and white. Now, here we are. What that means is that the signals operate automatically, allowing trains to run normally over the selected routes. Now, the route through the Severn Tunnel was one of the selected routes. Through routes does not, however, permit the operation of points, So the use of loop lines is precluded as well as bidirectional operation, yada yada. So straight through routes, like in the Severn Tunnel, perfectly fine to operate automatically. The signals worked automatically, clearing for the passage of trains without the signalman's intervention. So quickly flick up the Severn Tunnel layout again, or mocked up layout, and you can see 164, as I said when we were talking about train detection, as long as all the train detection's clear, 164 will go to green, and it will be red while there is a train in any of the train detection sections ahead of it up to 170. Simple. Just while we're skipping over it, part 14 here says Mr. X went on to use the control panel film to illustrate the telltale wire operation. So there's a wire in the tunnel. You've got 4 miles of tunnel, and inside it is a wire. And if something should happen, if there should be an accident in the tunnel, then the idea is that anyone who's stuck in the tunnel gets out and they break the wire, and that operates an alarm. And the alarm feeds back to the signal box. What a great idea. We'll get to that. And there's also a concentrator for 38 tunnel emergency phones. So it's a 4 mile tunnel. You get your calculators out. Okay, so that's fine. So that was on a Thursday. Through routes are working until 1400 hours on Friday the 6th of December, when a driver used the signal post telephone at N164. I feel like I should say November now, I'm reading from the report. And we're talking about being at the actual signal. November 164, to report to the signalman that the signal was at red. Now, if you've watched some of my other material, if you've watched my Semaphore Signal training course, you will know that if a driver stopped at the red signal for long enough, they are duty bound to contact the signaller and say, what the going on here? Why am I sat at this signal? So that's what they did. This is normal operating practice. On hearing that the signal was red, because the signaller didn't know that the signal was red, because the panel is blank, because the remote control, the TDM, reach for the dunce's cap, is down. So there are no indications in the signal box. Normally, the signaller would know that the signal's red because there's a little red light on the panel at N164. Not today. So, the signalman, on hearing that the signal was red, surprise, made arrangements for hand signalling to be introduced in accordance with the rules. Okay, how does that work? So here's the setup then. Our N164 is at red, and it's not going to change its mind. So the signaller has to take control of this whole setup somehow. And what they do is they appoint a hand signaller, and a hand signaller goes to N164. And they also appoint a tail lamp watcher. Now the purpose of the tail lamp watcher is to make sure that the complete train has passed through. So the train is going to approach November 164, and only the signaller, the hand signaller, is not going to decide on their own that it's acceptable to pass the signal. The signaller in the box is going to give that authority. So the hand signaller is going to give a hand signal to the train driver, allowing them to pass N164. And then the tail lamp watcher is going to phone the signaller, probably using the SPT at N170, and let them know, I have seen the whole train pass through. So this is a bit of a hangover from if you've got ye olde days of coal wagons and individual carriages being coupled together, and occasionally something comes uncoupled and you leave part of your train in the tunnel. So the tail lamp watcher is confirming not only has some of the train passed me, all of the train has passed me. So the signaller can then be confident, and you can see I've removed the arrow from the signaller to the hand signaller. The signaller can be confident that that first train has completely passed through. And it's a one-shot deal. If another train comes along, the signaller has to know that they've had that conversation with the tail lamp person, and they also have to have a new conversation with the hand signaller to say, yep, it's okay to let this next train pass. and it'll all be recorded in the book in the signal box. So from the Thursday morning we've got the loss of the TDM. On the Friday morning we lose the axle counter, and then we institute hand signalling duties, which isn't ideal, but it seems to be a system that works all day on the Friday through Friday night into Saturday morning. There isn't an explanation given why hand signalling was withdrawn, but it was on the Saturday morning. What we've got then is the drivers are stopping at the red signal, phoning the signaller, and proceeding on once they get permission. So that we've simply removed the element of the hand signaller, saving the drivers the effort of having to get out of the cab. Now, I did say that one of the limitations on track circuits was as a maximum length, and that can be brought down in various conditions. But one of the good things about axle counters is that there isn't a limit on the maximum length. So in the instance of the Severn tunnel, because operationally we only ever want one train in the tunnel at a time, that means that there was only one axle counter needed through that whole section. So where I've shown you an example of how track circuits would work and other train detection where you have multiple sections between two signals, unfortunately it's another layer and it's another big hole in the Swiss cheese that in this instance there was only one axle counter ahead of N164. So what happens is, and we're not quite sure why or who or how, but our first train, the HST, approaches N164 and it's at red, and permission is given by the signaller to proceed into the tunnel. Just after that happens, fault teams are on site and they fix the axle counter. And unfortunately, what we know is that once you reset 6005, N164 has got nothing preventing it being green. There's the only thing that was preventing that signal coming off with the through route set up, because the TDM is down, was that failed axle counter, and someone fixed it just as you saw there, just as the second train was approaching, the sprinter was approaching. So unfortunately, when our first train was given authority to proceed into the tunnel, it's at walking pace. There's a failure in the system, so you're not going at full speed. You have to proceed on as far as you can see, which effectively means you're driving at walking pace until you get to N170 signal, in which case the driver would have stopped at 170 and reported that he had passed through that section and hadn't come across any obstructions or there wasn't any physical damage to the railway there. So unfortunately, as that second train is approaching, our first train is going at walking pace. Our second train observes the signal at red, but the axle counter is repaired just as the second train is approaching and the signal comes off to green. And that's not an unusual occurrence in this instance. So the driver acted on the green signal that he observed on the day and proceeded into the tunnel. Not quite at full line speed. It transpires later, not quite at full line speed, but into the tunnel at speed, much greater speed than the first train, and rams into the back of the first train. So the evidence in the report about how the axle counter was fixed leaves it slightly open, but there is the most likely explanation is that the fuse that disconnects the axle counter from the rest of the signalling equipment was in while the technicians who were in the relay room at the evaluator working on it were fixing what was wrong with it. Now, the technician who was ultimately responsible as far as I think the conclusions of the report says that he removed that fuse when they started the work, and other people saw him remove the fuse and put it on top of the evaluator. They then did some work in the relay room and they did some work out on the track checking the axle counter operation, and when they returned they discussed how they didn't have any spare fuses. So that technician says that he then put the fuse in his pocket, and later on after the accident, when they were asked to leave the relay room by the transport police and by their supervisors, someone asked him about it, and he was able to produce it from his pocket in that location outside the relay room. So that seems to be fairly consistent evidence. But at the same time, the axle counter so that fuse didn't disconnect the axle counter itself, it just disconnected it from giving an output to the rest of the signalling system. So, and that's why he disconnected the fuse, so that they could work on it without it. They could fix it without it kicking back in and working and causing the accident that actually happened. So while that chap is adamant that he kept the fuse out, that fuse would had to have been in when they were working on the axle counter for it to have caused the accident in the way I've described. If that didn't happen, there would have had to have been some failure of the axle counter in an unpredictable way, in a way that no one has ever expected or experienced since, because axle counters have been used, the same type, extensively outside of that Severn tunnel accident. So I think the greatest likelihood as far as equipment failure goes is that the technicians, when they were carrying out their faulting work, perhaps absent-mindedly put that fuse back in, and they then fixed the fault whilst the fuse was in, and that allowed the signalling equipment to operate normally. Now, because you can see the accident that caused, that had already been thought about, that had already been planned, so there was a process for resetting axle counters, and we do know that those technicians, the same teams of technicians, were aware of it. They had been trained on how to reset axle counters, and there's evidence from them and others that they did use, including the signalman, that they did use the process when they were attempting to, the first time they attempted to fix it before they went outdoors to the trackside to see what was happening. And so it seems like it's not that they were deliberately not bothering to use that reset process, where of course again you have to phone the signalman, you have to check that line ahead is clear, that the expectation is that the axle counter is clear before you reset it. And so that's the process. They all knew it, and it appears like they were using it, and perhaps just in this one instance when they actually did fix it, for whatever reason, maybe that fuse was in. That seems the most likely outcome to me. What is also interesting is that they discovered, so our evaluators in the relay room, there's some internal wiring, there's some wiring to the other signalling equipment, some links, some disconnection links that you use that take you from indoor cables to outdoor cables. It's a transition between indoors and outdoors, and in this instance, what had originally caused the fault on the axle counter was that the links were disconnected. Now, another compounding factor in this is that the drawings in the relay room weren't all up to date. So there are crucial links which aren't identified, there are missing drawings, there are multiple failures, and another compounding factor is that not everyone is an expert in how axle counters work. Look at some of the testimony here. So the chap who had the fuse in his pocket, he says he had never seen a manual laying down a fault finding procedure, and he relied on his knowledge and experience. Now, these guys, relays, they're purely electrical, okay? It is just electricity whizzing around through switches. There's no electronics inside a relay. So this is where it gets a little bit complicated. You've got experienced technicians who know how electricity works, and they know how to fault find on relays. They know how to figure out what's happening with complicated signalling circuits. But they've got limited time on axle counters, limited learning. So there's a day appreciation course of how to set one up, how to do the maintenance on it, what voltages you should expect, Before we move on then, I said that was my conclusion in regards to equipment failure. There is one other possibility. Now, the driver of the Sprinter, the second train, his assertion after the incident was that he approached the signal N164, which was red. And as is not unusual at this location, as he approached it, it turned to green and he went into the tunnel on a green signal and began to accelerate. Fortunately, it wasn't quite at line speed by the time he hit HST. So what we know would have happened at the time, the equipment at the time in his cab would have given him a warning that the signal was red, and we know, or we believe after that he acknowledged that warning, otherwise the brakes would have come on. And witnesses on the train also support his view that they seemed to be going slowly, as you would do if you were approaching a red signal, and then all of a sudden the train took on some power and they sped up and they went into the tunnel. So those two things seem to be consistent. There wasn't actually any other equipment at N164 that would have stopped the driver. So if the driver approached the red signal and acknowledged the warning that he got on his train board equipment, and the signal stayed red, there was nothing to stop the driver just accelerating past that red signal. Based on everything that I've read in this, I don't believe that's what happened. Although it is interesting, I should point out, although this maybe doesn't support my conclusion, it's true that the second driver was advised by his lawyers and the union not to speak officially to the inquiry. So there you are, you can take what you will from that, but I do think it's most likely that the equipment was reset in the relay room. I made some faces at you, some knowing nods when we first spoke about the telltale wire. Again, you read in the report that the telltale wire was broken, not by persons, but failed 48 times in the year up to the accident. That's almost once a week. So in response to the accident, was quite poor. The communication wasn't very good. There were some phones out of order, but on the whole, the response was not quite in accordance with it. There was an emergency plan for the tunnel, but not everyone quite followed it, and I think that the emergency services were directed to the wrong end of the tunnel at one point as well. So the accident, I think our first train driver, the HST driver, called from phone 29. The phones are numbered from 1 to 38 from the English side. So 29, as you gather, is, best part of 3 miles into the tunnel. The emergency services initially were sent from the English side. It's not particularly helpful. The good news is that there were none of our injuries, as far as I can tell, at least from reading the report, were compounded by the long wait. So people didn't get brought out of the tunnel for another 2 hours. It's a long time to wait in the dark when you've had a train bounced off you. And as we saw at the start, 185 of the 300 people were injured. So more than half of the people were injured. Great response by some of the staff on site and by some of the members of the public. Doctors and nurses were basically triaging people on the train and trying to treat them and rescue the sprinter driver out of his cab. So good stuff from the public there, but from the railway as a whole, the response wasn't brilliant. Again, one of the first things that happened when the telltale wire was broken, the signaller waited to see, is it really an accident or has it just failed again? Overall, I really, really disappointed. No, they had actually, and to be fair to them, they had realised this at the time and they were trying to install a new system. So there were the 2 telltale wires, and you had to break, the idea was you had to break both of them to show that you were actually a person in an emergency and it wasn't a failure on one of these systems. And they were breaking it down into sections as well so they could identify where the breaks were and fix it quicker. Again, at the same time, it just shows the state of the infrastructure at the time. The TDMs failed, the axle counters have failed, the guys aren't really that well trained on axle counters, the guys are attending faults with the telephone system. It paints quite a bad picture overall of people trying to do a really good job in a not great system, a system that didn't really support them. There you have it then, a signalling failure which caused an accident, but not just the failure, actually the fixing of the failure caused the accident in this instance. There were so many holes in the Swiss cheese for this accident to happen that it was incredibly unlikely that it would happen right at the time, the fix would happen right as the sprinter was approaching the signal. If it happened at almost any other time, 2 or 3 minutes either way, we might have had a chance to prevent this accident. But as unlucky as that was, we were lucky that the injuries from the accident weren't much more serious. So let's not look a gift horse in the mouth. The big thing for me, of course, is to look back and say, do I think this accident could happen again? I don't think so. I think nowadays our signalling technicians are much better drilled. Me, as a trainee, that's when I first learned about this incident. I was briefed on this as a trainee. So before you're even trained on axle counters, you're told, if you don't know how it works, if you don't know what you're doing, you shouldn't be touching anything. So whoever originally disconnected those links in the first place, were they trying to fix one of the other faults? Were they doing something they shouldn't have been doing? We don't know, but at least it is now part of your training to make sure that you don't touch anything that you don't know what you're doing. Again, the technicians on the day weren't expertly trained. They'd been on an appreciation course. They had fault finding experience, but they didn't have fault finding experience on axle counters. I think now the training that's available for axle counters is much better. Axle counters themselves, there are different types in use, and they are a much more reliable piece of equipment in terms of just the environment that they go in and how they operate, and the training is better. Our competence management, so the supervisor of the S&T staff who were fixing the fault, he says in the report he's got something like 200 staff underneath him, and fortunately he was dedicated enough to know that one of the people he chose had at least been on the 1-day course. But our competence management now is much, much stronger. I think rather than just knowing or having, some S&T leaders, if they're dedicated, they will know, and some won't. They'll just phone someone else and say, who do we know that's good at this? It's not like that anymore. The competence management, knowing what equipment people are capable of working on and at what level, is all documented. It's all written down. So that's closed another hole in our Swiss cheese. Again, the crucial links for the axle counter, which originally started the axle counter problem, weren't marked in any way, and the records on site were not accurate. Nowadays, I think we're much better at that. Are we perfect? Probably not. But are we doing much better? Yes, I think we are. Inaccurate records is much more in focus now, and crucial links for disconnections are much easier to identify in a relay room now. So overall, I think the main on the signalling side of the accident, I think we've got the causes covered. And in terms of the response from the operations teams and the emergency services, I think those things are tightened up much better now. They had done some exercises in the past before this incident happened where things had went better, but I don't think they were as well briefed. These things are much better briefed now, and levels of responsibility, who speaks to who gives who what instructions, where it's, do the emergency services take over train running, does the train running take over what the emergency services are doing? That's all much better organised now. So, Severn Tunnel accident, a really unlucky one. Great that we didn't suffer any fatalities, or as far as the report says, no long-term injuries. Severn Tunnel then, I think we've got this one in the bag. Network Rail says they replaced over 4 miles of track to keep train services safe and reliable along this busy route. That is in July 2024. That's going to keep the track in tip-top condition for years to come, and I think we have got all the bases covered as regards the accident that happened in there back in 1991.